This episode is made possible by the realistic online game War Thunder. Check out this game through the link in the description below. Go through that link and not only do you support this show, but you get a free tank, aircraft, or ship, and 3 days of premium time as a bonus. And let's get into it. It was the shot heard around the world. On June the 28th, 1914, on a sweltering street in Sarajevo, a gunman fired into an open-topped car, killing Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The murder of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire was the push that set the dominoes of Europe falling. One by one, the great nations declared war, until countries as far away as India, Japan, and America had all been sucked into the quagmire. Known as World War I, that quagmire would kill 20 million people and change the course of history. But who was Franz Ferdinand? Who was this obscure archduke whose death set the world ablaze? Born into a branch of the Austrian royal family, Franz Ferdinand seemed destined for a life of rich obscurity, until one day tragic events conspired to make him the heir of his family's empire. As emperor-in-waiting, Ferdinand implemented reforms and worked on plans that could have changed everything, only for an assassin's bullet to cut him down too soon. In today's Biographics, we're investigating the life of the man whose death started World War I and considering what might have happened if he had lived. At the moment Franz Ferdinand first opened his eyes on the 18th of December 1863, not even the greatest seer could have predicted the tortured route that would lead him to dying on an anonymous Sarajevo street half a century later. At the time, Sarajevo was in the orbit of the decaying Ottoman Empire. Franz Ferdinand, meanwhile, had been born into the chilly air of the Ottomans' ancient enemy, Austria. Not that being enemies meant the empires were at war. In fact, they were in a period of relative peace that had allowed Ferdinand's ostensibly military family to become lazy and boring. Ferdinand's father, Archduke Karl Ludwig, was as staid and as conservative as a church bell tower. His mother, Maria Annunziata, was a Bourbon princess who'd done nothing of note. Yet for all their dull respectability, the family did have one claim to being interesting. Karl Ludwig was the brother of Franz Josef, the Habsburg Emperor of Austria. Not that Franz Ferdinand got much out of his famous uncle, though. Since Franz Josef already had a son, Rudolf, there was little chance that young Ferdinand would ever become emperor himself. Obviously, though, it wasn't impossible. He was third in line. But it was unlikely enough that Ferdinand was kept away from the corridors of power, even as he had to go through the standard Habsburg upbringing of God, army, and duty. Perhaps the only way the boy diverged from the standard Habsburg mold was in his passion for botany. While other Habsburg men valued their guns and uniforms, Franz Ferdinand found an unlikely outlet in flowers. From early childhood, it's said that he never looked quite as content as when he was gently pressing a rose between the pages of a book. Still, it's not like Ferdinand's horticultural side was a sign of an artistic spirit. He really did value guns and uniforms and enjoyed his conservative upbringing. The same cannot be said for Rudolf. The only son of Emperor Franz Josef, Crown Prince Rudolf had been born on August 21st, 1858, ending a run of unwanted baby girls. For Franz Josef, the arrival of a viable heir had been such a cause for celebration that it made Rudolf commander of an entire infantry regiment the very next day. No word on how the previous commander felt about being replaced by a literal newborn baby. But while his cousin Franz Ferdinand would enjoy his military upbringing, Rudolf absolutely hated it from the get-go. From a young age, Rudolf had been pushed off onto a sadistic tutor named Major General Count Leopold Gondrecourt. Gondrecourt was that bit of a dick physical education teacher that you had as a kid, pumped up on the 19th century notions of manliness and given carte blanche to do whatever he liked with Rudolf. The Crown Prince was made to exercise outdoors for hours in the depths of the Austrian winter. Guns were fired near his head in the middle of the night to wake him up. By 1865, Rudolf was a mental wreck, but still Franz Josef refused to fire Gondrecourt, believing Rudolf was a weakling who needed toughening up. Finally, Empress Sisi intervened, threatening to leave the royal household if Gondrecourt kept abusing their son. By then, though, the damage had already been done. Always a sensitive boy, Rudolf would never recover from the hard years he spent in the hands of the Count. It were these mental scars that would soon entwine his fate with that of Franz Ferdinand's. by the early 1880s, the two cousins had grown into very different people. Off on his family's estates, Franz Ferdinand had become exactly the sort of man the newly recognized Austro-Hungarian Empire was designed to churn out. He'd joined the army and become a captain within a year. Now he was in his early 20s and climbing the ranks, ready to serve his country. Even his love of flowers had been offset by a newfound passion for the masculine sport of hunting. And no one hunted quite like Franz Ferdinand. If it moved and it wasn't wearing an Austrian army uniform, then Ferdinand was more than happy to shoot it. It is estimated he shot over 250,000 animals in his lifetime. But despite the outward success of Ferdinand's military upbringing, it hadn't sanded off all of the rough edges. Adolf Franz Ferdinand was a man with a volcanic temper. Like many rich people, he was used to getting what he wanted, but whereas most rich people sulk in private when they don't, Ferdinand sulked openly for days on end. It got so bad that his army buddies would avoid him like we would avoid a pedophile made of Ebola. Still, at least Franz Ferdinand was broadly content. The same cannot be said for Rudolf. In the years since Count Gondrecourt had been kicked on his sadistic backside, Ferdinand's cousin had gone from bad to worse. He'd become melancholic, alcoholic, other colics that medical science hasn't yet even dreamed of. Yet, even as he emotionally decayed, Rudolf intellectually sharpened. At the time of our story, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was home to a kaleidoscope of ethnicities. There were Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Italians, Croats, Slovenes, Serbs, Romanians, Ukrainians, a whole lot. However, only Austrians and Hungarians were represented at the top. While that had been common in empires of the past, it wasn't so viable in a Europe now brimming with nationalism. As future emperor, Rudolf was desperate to reform things. Unfortunately, his father's motto was essentially do nothing and hope for the best. Franz Josef was slow, conservative, as suspicious of demands for autonomy as he was of his heir's reforming zeal. But rather than talk about it, Franz Josef simply sidelined Rudolf, marrying him off to Princess Stéphanie of Belgium, a woman so dull she could have been used as anesthetic. Frustrated at court, stuck with a wife he hated, and still dealing with the scars of his abusive childhood, Rudolf began to drift into a poisonous depression. Interestingly, it was around this time that Franz Ferdinand's life also took a grim turn. In the mid-1880s, the third in line to the throne was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a lung disease that killed many in the 19th century. But things were far worse for Rudolf. While Franz Ferdinand's disease was something that could be understood, Rudolf's disease was something that hid away from sight, something his family didn't even try to understand. It was an attitude that would lead to tragedy. On January 30th, 1889, Rudolf, now extremely depressed, took his 17-year-old lover, Baroness Mary Vetsera, to his hunting lodge, Mayerling. There, the two signed a suicide pact. Then Rudolf shot her through the head before turning the pistol on himself. The bullet that passed through Rudolf's brain did more than just kill the crown prince. It ended Franz Josef's line, extinguishing his only male heir. It was a moment when history trembled, then pivoted on its axis, when the multiverse branched. Poor Franz Ferdinand didn't know it yet, but Rudolf's 2 gunshots had just set him on a path to his own equally violent destiny. Of all the unintended consequences of Rudolf's suicide, Franz Ferdinand becoming heir was likely the most unintended of all. That's because Ferdinand was third in line to the throne. After Rudolf decided to decorate Mayerling's walls with the insides of his skull, the succession passed to Ferdinand's dad, Karl Ludwig. But Karl wasn't interested. Within days, he'd abdicated his claim. And just like that, Franz Ferdinand, hot-headed, military, flower-loving Franz Ferdinand, was the future emperor. For Emperor Franz Josef, this was a little like being forced to swallow a pint of freshly squeezed disappointment. Franz Ferdinand and Joseph did not get on. The emperor was a reserved man who never showed emotion to anyone but his beloved wife Sisi, while Franz Ferdinand, well, let's just say that the sulking and the volcanic temper had not improved with age. Even though Karl Ludwig abdicated his claim, Franz Josef refused to name Ferdinand as his heir. He claimed Ferdinand's tuberculosis made him unfit to be emperor, that he might die at any moment. So in 1892, Franz Ferdinand set off for warmer climes, desperate to relieve his infected lungs. For the next 2 years, the Archduke traveled the world, seeing the sights, taking in the air, and of course, shooting everything in sight. Ferdinand shot kangaroos in Australia, tigers in India, rare birds in Japan. When he returned in 1894, he actually brought 2 stuffed elephants that had shot back with him. Franz Josef's response? He declared his nephew's hobby was mass murder. But while the trip may have been bad for exotic wildlife, it had been good for Franz Ferdinand's lungs. The air returned revitalized, better than he'd been in years. Barely had he reached the empire than he was attending balls in Prague. It was here that the stuffy Archduke met Countess Sophie Chotek. In the entire history of Franz Ferdinand's life, there was almost nobody who remembered him fondly. He was too quick to anger, too prone to sulking, too much of an arsehole. The one exception was Sophie Chotek. Somehow, this Bohemian countess brought out a side in this gruff, unlikable man that no one else ever saw. A side that was tender, that was respectful. Maybe Sophie was the closest human equivalent Ferdinand ever found to one of his flowers. Something rare and radiant that made him feel things that he otherwise never experienced. And naturally, Franz Josef hated her. Sophie may have been rich, but she was a mere countess. For these snobbish Habsburgs, she just wasn't posh enough. So the emperor forbid their union, pushed his new heir away just as had once pushed Rudolf away. Unlike Rudolf, though, Franz Ferdinand was willing to fight. All through that miserable decade, the heir argued with the emperor. He argued with him as Karl Ludwig succumbed to typhoid fever, as Empress Sisi was felled by an assassin in Geneva. Finally, in 1900, Ferdinand hit the jackpot. After years of cajoling, Pope Leo XIII, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and Tsar Nicholas II all pleaded to Franz Josef on Ferdinand's behalf. Faced with the head of his rebellion, the head of his closest allied nation, and the head of the nation he desperately wanted to be allied with, all appealing to him, Franz Josef at last relented. The emperor allowed Ferdinand and Sophie Chotek to marry that very year, but there was a catch. Before he could tie the knot, Franz Ferdinand was made to sign an oath, excluding both of his children from the line of succession and Sophie from all official ceremonies. It was a high price to pay, but it was the only offer that Franz Ferdinand would ever get. And reluctantly, he agreed. It's doubtful anyone realized it, but at that moment, the multiverse branched yet again, taking the empire ever further from peace and from survival. Franz Josef may not have realized it, but his obstinacy had just doomed them all. Now, before we continue this video, how about you doom some of your enemies in War Thunder? And how's that for an appropriate transition? Now let's just jump over to the computer because that's a great way for me to show you the game.
Hello everybody, welcome to War Thunder. In this game, this is a good looking game. Yeah, we're in a tank. This is a tank. It just looks great. I have to say, I was loading up the recording software and I did not pay attention to what our objective was. So I'm just going to go and find some bad guys and let's mess them up. How great is this? I bet I can destroy this. I can destroy it because that's the kind of game this is. And this is free. And if you go through our link... Oh, I didn't mean to knock down that tree. But it was cool that I did. Let's go up here and see what's going on. I bet there's some bad guys. These guys behind me are way more cautious, which means I'm definitely going to get blown up. But he's pretty far away. Where are we? Are we in, like, I don't know. That's kind of American or something. Okay. Oh, wait. We're not in America. This is Japan. You want some of this? I don't think that was a hit somehow. Seemed like a pretty direct smash, though. Oh. Oh, come on. Ah, yes. I destroyed him, but he hit me. Somehow I am still Oscar Mike. I don't think I've played Japan before. Playing a lot of Eastern Europe for a while. Bosh. Let's just call that camouflage, shall we? Oh God. That's not good. That's not good. Can we bring it around? Ugh. Turns out you can't fly a plane without a wing. This is War Thunder. Get that free tank or plane or ship. Use the link below in a few days of premium time and let's get back to the video.
Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it is one of those misquotes that has been attributed to just about everybody. But in the context of the early 20th century, Austro-Hungary is absolutely something Franz Josef should have kept in mind. Having contributed to Rudolf's breakdown by isolating him at court and forcing him to marry someone he had nothing in common with, the emperor was now turning his guns on his heir. The marriage of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie Chotek had been a personal insult to Franz Josef. He instructed everyone at court to ignore Ferdinand's new wife. At the same time, he began pushing his nephew away from the business of government, castrating him politically. Rudolf had tried to reform the empire, but had been sidelined, and now Franz Ferdinand was about to suffer the same fate. So why did Franz Josef so singularly fail both of his heirs? Well, there's a lot of debate about this, but one possible reason is that he ascended to the throne when he was just 18 and simply wasn't aware that most future emperors needed guidance and needed teaching. When Ferdinand tried to follow in Rudolf's footsteps and modernize the empire, he got neither of those things. The emperor just blanked him. And this was a problem because at the dawn of the 20th century, Franz Ferdinand was the only one with ideas for holding the Austro-Hungarian Empire together. Like Rudolf, Ferdinand had become obsessed with the issue of nationalism in the multi-ethnic empire. But while Rudolf had tried to implement minor reforms, Ferdinand wanted to overhaul the whole system. Franz Ferdinand's plans ranged from splitting the empire into a United States of Austria to elevating the South Slavs, aka the Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, to joint ruler status alongside the Austrians and Hungarians. But don't go thinking Ferdinand was a Rudolf-style liberal. Absolutely not. The man was a reactionary conservative who hated Hungarians, hated Slavs, wasn't that hot on Jews, and thought Austria had a God-given right to stomp all over its minorities. He was, in short, a really unpleasant man. But here's the thing about unpleasant men. They can sometimes do the right thing for the wrong reason. Franz Ferdinand's plans for liberalizing the empire, granting all men the vote, and giving each nationality more autonomy may have come from a cynical calculation that it was the only way to keep his family in power, but it really would have improved things for millions. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that a reformed federal Austria-Hungary would have survived right up to today. But we'll never know for sure because Franz Josef nixed every single plan that Ferdinand had. In the court, these stifled reforms turned Franz Ferdinand into a laughingstock. It was whispered in Vienna that the heir was clinically insane, that his family's inbreeding had finally caught up with him. For a while, Ferdinand tried to brave the storm, but even this insanely unpopular man wasn't immune to public opinion. In the mid-1900s, Ferdinand and Sophie abruptly quit Vienna. They retired to their home of Konopishtia in what is now the Czech Republic and settled down to a life of domestic bliss. It was almost a happy ending. Together, the couple had 3 children, and Franz Ferdinand settled back into his old passion of horticulture, creating one of the world's largest rose gardens. In another time, in another place, that might have been the end of things, with Sophie a happy mother and Ferdinand quietly pressing roses by candlelight, all the cares of the empire forgotten. But this was Europe in the 20th century, a tinderbox less than a decade away from exploding. For Franz Ferdinand and Sophie, there would be no peace. The wheels were already in motion. Their violent fate was waiting for them. On the 28th of June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie disembarked from a train in the Bosnian city of Sarajevo and stepped into an open-topped car. It was a hot day, and the river running through the center of the city was lower than usual. But as the motorcade whipped past, it wasn't the river the Archduke should have been looking at. It was the crowds. Near the city's Old Latin Bridge, Nedeljko Cabrinovic and Gavrilo Princip waited, anonymous faces amid the assembled masses. In the pockets of their heavy coats sat bombs and guns. Near their trembling fingertips lay cyanide capsules. They and their comrades had one goal: to kill the heir of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. To understand why, we need to quickly wind back Father Time's videotape. Remember when we told you Sarajevo was part of the decaying Ottoman Empire? Well, 15 years after Franz Ferdinand's birth in 1878, the Ottoman Empire had completely decayed in the Balkans, losing nearly all of its territories. In this power vacuum, the Austro-Hungarians had marched, taking over Bosnia on the strict understanding that they were only there to keep the region from imploding. But Vienna and Budapest had no intention of ever leaving. In 1908, they'd officially annexed the region. But rather than passing virtually unnoticed, it had caused a European crisis. An outraged Russia had permanently turned its back on Austria-Hungary. In the Balkans, Serbs had declared the empire their mortal enemy. And now Cabrinovic and Princip were determined to make the empire pay. Interestingly, though, they nearly didn't get their chance. The night before, Franz Ferdinand had had a premonition that all would not be well in Sarajevo. But it was his and Sophie's wedding anniversary, and these semi-unofficial trips with minimal security were the only ones Franz Josef allowed Sophie to go on. So here the couple were, speeding alongside the half-dry river in Sarajevo, blissfully unaware of the men waiting to kill them. As the car roared past the Latin Bridge, Cabrinovic whipped out a bomb and hurled it, but the bomb bounced off the car and hit a police escort behind, blowing them up instead. In a panic, Cabrinovic forgot about his gun and tried to commit suicide by leaping into the river, only to land on the dried-out bank, missing the water and breaking his legs. As Gavrilo Princip watched in a daze, the car carrying his and Cabrinovic's targets just motored away at speed. It failed. Except, as you already know, he hadn't. What comes next was like something out of a tragic farce. The car carrying Ferdinand and Sophie stopped at the city hall as scheduled, but rather than focus on getting the hell away from Sarajevo, everyone carried on like nothing had happened. Once the ceremony was over, Franz Ferdinand even insisted on driving back into town to check on the wounded. As someone who'd been there that day later said, "We all felt awkward because we knew that when he went out, he would certainly be killed." Yet no one stopped the Archduke from getting back in the car. No one told the driver to take a different route in case more assassins were waiting. And no one raised a finger as Ferdinand and Sophie headed back towards the Latin Bridge, where Gavrilo Princip was still standing, in shock, unable to believe that he'd missed his chance to assassinate the Austrian heir. One can only wonder how he felt when he saw the car motoring back toward him like a moving target going around a shooting range carousel, giving him another shot at the grand prize. And it was a shot that Princip gladly took. The first bullet hit Sophie, killing her almost instantly. The second thudded into Franz Ferdinand's chest, turning his bright blue uniform a brilliant red. As the crowd set upon Princip, the car sped away from the scene. In the back, Franz Ferdinand held poor dead Sophie Chotek, whispering in her lifeless ear, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for the children." As the blood seeped through Ferdinand's tunic, a bodyguard asked if he was hurt. "It's nothing," the heir said, irritable to the last. "It's nothing. It's nothing." Those were the last words Franz Ferdinand ever uttered. As news broke that evening that the heir to the Austrian throne had been assassinated, Europe plunged into a state of shock. In every capital, in every embassy, people wondered what it might mean, if it even meant anything. But make no mistake, this was old Europe's 9/11, the moment that would change everything. In just over 1 month's time, the entire continent would be at war. Although the life of Franz Ferdinand ended that hot June day, his story didn't. In the aftermath of the assassination, Austrian intelligence reported the attack had been organized by the Serbian government. Vienna nearly invaded that very same week. Today, some historians think this could have prevented World War I. Sympathy initially lay with Austria, and a quick strike might have been seen as justified. But the realities of the empire meant Budapest had to be consulted first, and both capitals wound up dithering until the shock had faded, by which point Russia was reasserting its military alliance with Serbia. In Vienna, Emperor Franz Josef agonized over what to do. He'd now lost his second heir in a violent, unforeseen incident. But unlike Rudolf's suicide, this time there was a physical enemy, someone the Austrians could get revenge on. By July, the drumbeat of war echoing over Europe was unmistakable. On the 28th, Franz Josef officially signed a document declaring war on Serbia. Austrian troops marched that same day. Yet even now, World War I was not inevitable. It wasn't until Russia began to mobilize to defend Serbia that Europe hit the point of no return. The sight of Russia mobilizing scared the Germans, who in turn began mobilizing against the Russians. The French then got double scared and began to mobilize against the Germans, which led to the German decision to attack France first via Belgium, which in turn dragged Britain into the war. It was the dominoes falling one by one, adding up to a chain reaction that couldn't be stopped. By August, Europe was at war. It wouldn't end until 20 million were dead, and Austro-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Tsarist Russia had all collapsed into dust. Not that Franz Josef lived to see it, though. The elderly emperor died in 1916, halfway through the war. It's possible that on his deathbed he looked back on both Rudolf and Franz Ferdinand, his two dead heirs, and wondered if their reforms might have saved his empire. The last time Franz Ferdinand appeared in history as anything other than the trigger for World War I was 1917. That year, a huge statue of him was unveiled in Sarajevo on the very spot where he was killed. It was a heartfelt tribute from the city's Austrians. It was also a short-lived one. After World War I ended and Austria collapsed, the statue was destroyed. Later, under Tito's Yugoslavia, it was replaced by monuments celebrating not the murdered Franz Ferdinand, but rather his assassin, Gavrilo Princip. Today, Franz Ferdinand has been almost entirely forgotten. Sure, his name is famous, his place in the history books is assured, but the Ferdinand we remember is not a full person. He's just a symbol, a single image of a portly man in silly clothes sat in an open-topped car seconds before his death shattered an entire world. His face and name may remain, but his soul has been forgotten. It's said that some men are born to greatness, while others have greatness thrust upon them. The life of Franz Ferdinand belongs to another, much less known category, one of men who were not great, or even particularly notable, but without whom we wouldn't have the modern world. He may have been moody, he may have been hard to love, but Franz Ferdinand was also a human being. Next time November rolls around and you see someone wearing a poppy, spare a thought for the accidental heir, for the man who, in death, unwittingly changed history. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe. Brand new videos just like this several times a week, and when you're subscribing, hit the notification bell. Also, please do check out our fantastic sponsor, War Thunder. They are linked to below, and as always, thank you for watching.